Everyone, the time is now 11 a.m. We're going to begin the debate on Adam Smith versus Ayn Rand with C. Boyden Gray, Jennifer Grossman, and Jeffrey Tucker, our moderator.
Welcome, men and women of FreedomFest, to the great debate. We have with us today, as astonishing as it may seem, two of the most influential market thinkers in the history of humanity. Two people who separately laid the foundations for a lot of what we at this conference believe in, a lot of what people around the world embrace as human freedom, the commercial society, and the liberal society. I give to you today the great Adam Smith and the great Ayn Rand, two thinkers who agree on so much and yet have different perspectives. Now, I can just say, now here's the way we're going to do this. I'm going to give just a few more minutes of opening talking points, and we're going to go to 10 minutes of Adam Smith, 10 minutes of Ayn Rand, 5 minutes for them to speak to the comments of the other, and then 25 minutes of Q&A, and I'll take up the first few minutes of that with some basic questions, then we'll open it up to the audience. And please be deferential and respectful to the status, to the greatness of these two people, and also profoundly aware of what a great act of generosity and beneficence it is for us to experience this honor, to hear from their own mouths an interpretation, understanding of the world. So let's just give them both a hand. Okay, may I? We owe them so much. You know, I waited too long after my I guess you could say conversion to market theory to read Adam Smith, and I read just 2 months ago for the very first time Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is just an incredibly powerful work. If you haven't read it, you start at the beginning, you can't put it down until the very end. And isn't it so beautiful how Adam Smith continues to talk to us today with such prescience and beauty and power in his two great works, not just the theory, but also Wealth of Nations, which asked that great question, where does wealth come from, and gave us such answers to last the age. And capitalism could have done much worse, our founding father, in so many ways. So indebted to Adam Smith. Whenever Deirdre McCloskey says the name Adam Smith, she goes like this. Yeah, so I feel like. So we're also going to do that to Ayn Rand here, and I'm not sure she would fully appreciate that. However, I am of the very strong opinion that her influence is underrated when you consider the status of post-war liberalism, what happened after World War II, and where people were, the complete death of liberal ideology, capitalism, and the absence, really, of libertarianism, and the number of people she influenced. My own mentor, Murray Rothbard, credits her with basically everything about his thought. His love of property rights and human liberty and that sort of thing. And people talk a lot about Ayn Rand. Again, I think she's underestimated the poetry, the power, the drama that she brought to the story of the commercial society has still unequaled to this day, in my view. You can't read Atlas Shrugged and come away the same person. You feel braver, you feel taller, you feel stronger, you feel a greater sense of ennoblement of your right to live a dignified life. And God bless this great woman. So I've taken up my 5 minutes, and I would like to give the next 10 over to the genius of the age, our dear Adam Smith.
It is a great pleasure to address this audience. You may wonder, why am I here? Adam Smith was short, slightly paunched, and he never wore anything like this. He lived with his mother all his life. He was a nerd. He was a wonk. And I'm only dressed up to look slightly spry because I have no competition against the absolutely glamorous, electric, magnetic, creative, and amusing Ayn Rand. So we equalize somehow by giving me this very, very fancy vestment, which would be unheard of in Scotland, I think, for Adam Smith, and I'm for Scott. And I think for Scots who move to the South, which is what I am, and so when I speak with a slight Southern lilt, that's the way the Scots speak. So you have to bear with me. I am speaking in a Scottish brogue from North Carolina. So the framing, I think, is important. Both Ayn Rand and I came oddly and counterintuitively, perhaps, from similar circumstances. Of course, she came from a black and white, really awful situation of communist Russia, where the stark contrast between there and here and the rest of the free world were truly, truly startling. But I didn't come from a totally different background. I came out of the end of feudalism, which was also very autocratic. The monarchy, princes, a lot of abuse, and this was a time in the 18th century of entering into an industrial revolution, a total freeing up of the rules of feudal society, new opportunities in commerce, and it was radical change. And so who was going to deal with that? And that is what both of us were reacting to. We ended up in the same place: free market, individual liberty, no government at all if we could possibly avoid it, but in any event, the smallest government of all. And there are other similarities, but I think the most important one of all the similarities was a heightened sense of the absolute, desperate importance of morality and ethics. So there's so much in common that they should be paired. And the differences illuminate weaknesses, if you will, or absences of thought on both sides, and you combine the two together and you have a very, very, very powerful statement from these past years. I go back 300. She's barely dead. In fact, she looks very much alive to me. So how did they arrive at these common positions? Well, they arrived in a very, very different way. And the differences, I think I'm going to try to explain in a few minutes, hopefully with more time later when you ask questions. How could the differences, which are not insignificant, how could the differences have produced a similar overall, but still different, nuanced responses? And I think the key difference is that here, Ayn Rand started from reason. Now, here I am, a member of the board of the Reason Foundation, celebrating its 50-something anniversary here, and I'm saying that the difference was that Adam Smith started from passion. For Ayn Rand, reason ruled the passions. For Adam Smith, passion ruled reason. Now, if you can figure that out, you figure a great deal out. But what Adam Smith was dealing with was how to reconcile the complexity of human nature with the reality of the world around him. And how did he do it? And he was led by many theories that were swirling around in the 18th century based on the notion of sympathy. We might say empathy, but it's not quite the same thing. It's like you putting yourself in the shoes of your neighbor or your counterparty in a business transaction and saying to yourself, well, how would that person really think of how I'm treating him or her? Because it's going to it's going to reflect one way or another. You can fool and cheat a partner once or twice, but that's it. It's over. So you kind of have to worry. And so sympathy led to a thing called the impartial spectator kind of conscience, a kind of way of looking. Well, how am I being observed? How do I look to the outside world? And that led to the invisible hand, which led to a cornucopia of economic development, which I'll get to in a minute. But they were struggling all the time with what to do with human nature. What about us? We're not all that good, you know. I mean, human nature's got a lot of faults, and Lord knows we commit a lot of sins. One great difference between the two was that Ayn Rand was an atheist and Adam Smith was not. Ayn Rand emphasized morality, and so did Smith. As Smith said, religion is a good thing because it really supports ethical values. We both think that is at the very top of the list, ethical values. Now, Adam Smith had a lot of help from friends. He was a great friend of David Hume, who was much more electric and magnetic than his great friend Adam Smith. He could show up in Paris, and before you could even say Facebook, crowds would surround him and follow him around the streets of Paris. Adam Smith could have walked up and down the Champs-Elysees for a week and no one would ever know who he was. So Hume really was a rock star in the way that Ayn Rand was. And Hume really in many ways is a better foil, but unfortunately he didn't quite attain the success of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was also deeply influenced by Samuel Johnson, who was not a Scot, but whose biography Boswell was, and who sort of brought him into the family. Now, Smith and his compatriot, later friend, did not get along very well with Samuel Johnson. They were competitors. They were competitors for who had the moral high ground. But they both agreed on all the tenets of sympathy, the moral conscience mirroring, and you might want to say, if I could sum it up, it's a question of the golden rule. What goes around comes around. And that's as simple as I can put it. It's oversimplified, but that's the thing to remember. And it's easy because we were all brought up with it. We're all brought up with it in a religious sense, doing to others as you would have them doing to you. And we were brought up in a secular sense in the office. What goes around comes around. So that's at the heart of all of this. Hard to believe that could turn into the greatest economic treatise ever, but it did. And what it meant for, and other differences, is that because of his hatred, really almost hatred, certainly distrust of Edinburgh businessmen, Adam Smith was no great cheerleader for business. I mean, he thought what motivated self-interest, what motivated the individual worker was terribly important. With big business, he thought always could and would take over parts of the government for its own benefit, a crony capitalism if given any chance. So he thought a lot of money had to be put into a judiciary independent of the executive to protect private property, to protect against monopolies, to keep the system open for ordinary people. And that was expensive. So he was in favor of taxes. Now, she didn't like taxes. I tried to explain to her yesterday that I think there's a quote where she says, Ayn Rand says, taxes are theft. Well, I couldn't find it, but I found something pretty close. Her idea was that all of this necessary to support a very important judiciary, to protect private property, and to Are you having trouble hearing in the back?
I'm enjoying your talk, but we can't hear you. Can you hear me now? Yeah, it's excellent.
We've got about 1 minute left.
About 1 minute. I'm so sorry that this has worked out this way, but at least you can see my dress and you can see how. So he didn't believe that taxes, that voluntary contributions would pay for the kind of infrastructure that you needed for defense, for the building of common goods infrastructure, and to protect against monopolies. And I want to use my last minute to say he didn't feel that voluntary payments would take care of trade. He wrote Wealth of Nations in part to attack mercantilism. This has a certain echo today. The notion of our current chief executive that the strength of a country is based on the size of its trade surplus would have shocked Smith, and he spent much of Wealth of Nations demolishing that idea, and it's been discredited until recently. He didn't like that. He would much prefer to see a division of labor, people working prosperously, with prosperity, for prosperity, and not worry because it'll all balance out in the end about who has the biggest trade deficits. But I think in my lifetime as an American, moving forward a little bit, that I don't think during my lifetime we ever ran a trade deficit, ever ran a trade surplus, and the United States is the biggest, the richest country in the world. The thing to remember is that Adam Smith opened up a whole new world for the modern world, making it make such economic strides you can't believe. Great Britain, of course, did very well. We've done very well since. Ayn Rand inherited this. She came into this world of extraordinary opportunity, and really that owes a lot to Adam Smith. I just wish that he had, that I had, I wish that I do have the electricity, because we could make this much more understandable to the rest of you if I had her charm and she had some of my nerdness.
Thank you, Adam Smith. I'd like to invite you on stage to take a seat. And we will now hear from Ayn Rand for 10 minutes.
Well, first of all, I must say I'm very glad I do not believe in an impartial spectator. As someone that I would see myself through the eyes of the impartial spectator, because if I did, I am fairly certain that I would appear extremely ridiculous dressed up like this. I'm also very grateful that Adam Smith is alive again today. We need him now more than ever, because another thing that we thought was dead for many centuries has come back, and that is a belief again in tariffs. So we need you now, Adam Smith, more than ever. I would like to start by thanking and recognizing Mr. Smith for helping to lay the foundations of modern capitalism. But in laying the foundations, he made some sloppy mistakes. And as a result, the defense of capitalism has been on shaky ground ever since. There is much to be praised in his work: his defense of self-interest, his vigorous promotion of free trade, his focus on division of labor as driver of economic wealth. But his elevation of sentiment over reason has led to a kind of moral relativism that still plagues us today. In my life, I fought a battle against this kind of relativism, sentimental relativism, in favor of a philosophy based on reality as an objective absolute. Hence, I called my philosophy objectivism. I hold that the only way of perceiving this objective reality is with man's mind, reason. Therefore, when it comes to morality, man needs a rational morality in recognizing the difference between right and wrong. This, and not so-called theory of moral sentiments, is the proper foundation for a free and flourishing society, for a life of happiness, achievement, and self-esteem. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has until now been believed impossible. Namely, a morality not based on sentiment, not based on conformity to the values of others, not based on edicts, whether given by God or by society, but based on reason. A morality which can be proved by means of logic, demonstrated to be true and necessary. My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on earth, if he wants to live as a human being, he must hold reason as an absolute. In other words, he must hold reason as his only means of perceiving and deciding difference between right and wrong. You say, sir, that man should endeavor to seek the applause of others, that we should seek the approval of the impartial spectator. But if the essence of morality is to seek the approval of others, whether real or imaginary or hypothetical, then how will we ever come to develop our own moral capacity to make judgments? Throughout centuries, we have struggled with the question, why should man be good? Standard religious answer, God is watching. Apparently, God is not too happy with me at the moment. Quite pipe down, God, please. Now, I grant you credit, at least, Mr. Smith, you have replaced God with impartial spectator. But at the end of the day, it really is more or less the same thing. We should not strive to do what is right because others, whether real or imaginary, think we should. Rather, we should strive to develop our own independent moral judgment. In a way, your moral psychology reminds me of a character in one of my books. His name was Peter Keating. We meet him at the beginning of The Fountainhead. How many of you have read this very most excellent book? Okay, good. I think you need to go back and reread it, please. And he is having a happy day. It is his graduation. He is feeling very happy because he is feeling the admiration of others. He is feeling eyes on his head. He is thinking constantly of what others are thinking of him. So this kind of thinking of what others is thinking of you is not a proper foundation for morality. The approval of others, the disapproval of others is foundational to your theory of moral sentiments. As objectivists, we do not seek the approval of others, although we welcome it if we think their judgment is correct, and therefore I do welcome your approval of me. More importantly, we will tolerate the disapproval of others. In fact, the disapproval of everyone if we think that their judgment is incorrect. Men should practice fundamental independence, fundamental selfishness. By this I mean man's highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness. Each man must live as an end in himself and must practice rational pursue his rational self-interest. Second, while we agree government's primary role is a protection of private property, I would argue that this should be government's exclusive role to protect private property. In your Wealth of Nations, you ask, as so many do, who will build the roads? Who will build the bridges? Who will build the infrastructure? Well, this raises a prior question. Who will pay for all of this? Once you acknowledge that someone has to earn the wealth that will pay for the roads, then you have no right to tell that person how they must spend their money. If you need his money, if you want his money, then you must obtain it by voluntary consent. Third, you argue that government has a role in educating children. And on this, I most vehemently disagree. Government schools are not run for children. They are not run, certainly, for parents. Government schools are run for government, to indoctrinate, to employ government workers, and to cripple young minds so that they are incapable of critical and independent thought. And we see the results of this all around us today. Despite my great admiration for you, Mr. Smith, there were a few inconsistencies and lack of clarity in some of your work, which I encourage and invite you to clarify today. Some of those have had fairly disastrous consequences. I have lived through those consequences myself in Russia, where my family's property was expropriated in the name of the public good by the communists. Their hero, of course, was Karl Marx. And you may not know this, but Karl Marx actually references some of your works in promoting his evil ideas. Did you know this happened? Very, very bad. In particular, this was the question of what comes first. Is it wages or profits? Of course, some have interpreted your work to say that wages come first. Of course, we know this is not true. Profits come first. But regardless, there is a bit of an inconsistency which Marx later exploited to set up a dynamic of conflict between wage earners and capitalists and to promote his class warfare. Now, whether or not you can say that perhaps this was a technicality or a misinterpretation of your work, I still have a hard time understanding why, for example, you would oppose tax on consumption, rightly so, and yet you would approve tax on luxury for the rich. Why you would approve that everyone should pay taxes in proportion to what they earn, but that the rich would pay a little bit more. Now, while I believe that there are a few inconsistencies in your work, and for this, even despite my admiration, I judge your misjudgments perhaps a little harshly, I hold still that man has free will, even apparently after he is dead. And so therefore, I encourage you to correct your flaws, to correct the record, and deserve our unreserved admiration as the father of capitalism.
I'm seeing now that on the clock we have exactly 20 minutes left. We want to make sure that you have the chance to participate in this extremely rare, unusual, probably not to be repeated occasion to ask Adam Smith and Ayn Rand actual questions. So we'll have a short response by Adam Smith, and then Ms. Rand will respond.
my view was not that people had to act according to how others wanted them to act, but rather that one should look as an individual at himself in a mirror, as it were, and say, well, what would that other person think about me if I did X, Y, or Z? And that's not depending on what the other person thinks. It's what you're trying to figure out how best you should behave, and it is a reflection of one's own self-esteem that I think drives this, not what other people thought, because people weren't asking that question. The taxes have seemed to come up a great deal, and how do you pay for this? We still have this problem. But I do want to assure everybody in this room that Adam Smith believed in the smallest government possible, consistent with what safeguards had to be put in, such as defense and defense of private property. He believed that the division of labor, that the work of the marketplace relieved government of having to do any work at all. And his great collaborator, intellectually, if not socially, although they became great friends later, was someone who felt very, very strongly that the government could only mess things up. And so that I hope you don't think the taxes are being raised or being thought of by myself as a way of taking things away from you and redistributing them to other people. That wasn't the point. The point was to make sure that, in fact, things weren't taken from you and redistributed to other people who weren't doing anything at all. That was a central point of it, and I think that's something that is critical to remember. As to the results, I let the results speak for themselves. After Adam Smith, the world enjoyed an explosion of wealth such as had never been seen ever in the history of the world, and we are still seeing this extraordinary explosion continue, notwithstanding all of the turmoil and whatnot that we feel here and in Europe and elsewhere. It's still the best system. I don't think mercantilism is going to make it any better. I think mercantilism is going to make it worse, as Adam Smith predicted. So let's hope that doesn't be what turns out in the coming months and years. So anyway, I appreciate and am honored to be in the presence of such an articulate and magnetic personality.
Ms. Rand.
Thank you. I take your point very well about the impartial spectator, not in a literal sense, but in looking at the mirror, in seeing yourself as other people see you. I think in retrospect, maybe I could have done a little better job of this myself. But I also have, since I have come back, become aware of some other work done by a philosopher named Dr. David Kelly, who is here with us in this room. And, hello. He has made some contributions to this area in which he has raised benevolence as a major virtue. He has talked about the importance of individuals in social situations as viewing each other as potential trading partners. This is a generosity that we extend to others, not based on anything that they have done for us, but also not based on self-sacrifice, but based in a spirit of a benevolent interest where they may become partners in some kind of exchange. So if that is a way to interpret your arbiter, your impartial spectator, then I would come around more to your point of view. I would also say, however, I must say I vehemently do not accept, reject the idea that taxes are theft, Now I know this is going to put me at odds with many in this room, my friends here who are libertarians, but at least in that regard, I would say that we have made some progress, some rapprochement since the days when I did regard many libertarians in a largely negative light, and I called you the hippies of the right. I know this was not very nice of me, but I will also say that I have seen a degree of maturity among the modern libertarians that was not necessarily apparent in my day. So I do not believe that taxation is theft. I believe that taxation should be voluntary. I believe it is necessary. However, as I make clear in my work, this should not be the first step towards a free society, but the last step. This is not the first reform, but the last.
We have about 14 minutes really for Q&A, and I'm going to take the moderator's privileges here by asking a series of short questions, and by doing so, I hope to inspire you also to ask short questions, and maybe we can get some very short answers from Professor Smith and Ms. Rand. First, Adam Smith, what is the source of wealth?
The division of labor.
Ms. Rand?
Man's mind and innovative capacity.
There's a big difference between the two. Are businessmen heroes, Professor Smith?
In his view, they could be, but in general, they didn't deserve always to be thought to be.
Ms. Rand?
I know some have characterized my view as venerating businessmen in any situation. However, this is not correct. For those of you who have read Atlas Shrugged, and how many of you have read Atlas Shrugged?
Yes,
Very good.
Yes,
Then you know very well that two of my greatest villains in the book, James Taggart and Orrin Boyle, were businessmen. So that said, there were very few, if perhaps no one else before me, who came and took a celebratory view of businessmen and dramatized their achievements and put them in the proper moral perspective.
Well, so I'm going to put you both in the spot and ask an impossible question, beginning with Adam Smith. What is the source of morality?
For him, it was interaction at first because of every person's innate desire for sociability, and later for trade because of everybody's insatiable desire to better themselves. And you learn morality through your interactions in sociability contexts, in your community, and in your trading operations.
Yep.
He would say that commerce was always the best guarantor of liberty and security.
It's a surprising answer in some way, which leads to my follow-up, beginning with Adam Smith. What is the role of religion in society?
He didn't think it had a predominant role, but he didn't denigrate it either as well or as much as his mentor, David Hume, did. Recent book out you should read called The Infidel and the Professor, and the infidel is David Hume, who was a much more popular figure in his time than Smith was. Smith thought religion was a very, very good thing because it so strongly reinforced morality, which he thought was the central, most important value.
Can I ask a follow-up real quick on that? Did Adam Smith ever introduce scandal to his contemporaries for being insufficiently faithful to the Christian religion?
Did he?
Yes.
He never brought on any scandal on himself, but Hume was constantly under attack, and he more or less defended Hume. Hume was hugely controversial, and yet he was a rock star everywhere in Europe. Even in England, he was a rock star. So I don't know how to answer your question. He was the infidel. He didn't believe that morality came from the deity, and actually neither did Adam Smith. But Adam Smith did think that religion was very supportive of what was critical to the workings of any good society.
Very good. Ms. Rand?
I am glad to hear that you did not invite scandal during your day, of course. As you know, I did not invite scandal either, although it happened somewhere along the way. I don't know exactly how. But in terms of a religion, I would say if a religion qua a religion is a mysticism, then this is detrimental to man's self-esteem and psychology. You were asking earlier about what is the source of morality. Human beings, unlike animals, cannot survive based on instinct. They must make decisions, and therefore they require a rational capacity. And it is this requirement of a rational capacity that is the source of morality. That said, also, I will not be entirely perhaps as critical of a religion as you may think that I would be. I have come to recognize there are many people who are admirers of my work, who also practice some kinds of religious devotion to a greater or lesser degree. That said, also, religion was man's most primitive form of philosophy. It was his blind groping towards philosophy. Now, I believe, however, we have matured beyond this to have a capacity for philosophy and to reserve the asceticism, the exalted purity, which was once reserved for religion, belongs properly to the realm of philosophy.
As the people with questions can line up now, and as they line up, I'd like to ask you both to comment briefly on a subject that's gigantically important in our times. And I don't know if either of you have had a chance to read the newspapers lately, but let me just ask you point blank, Adam Smith, how important is international trade?
So, well, if you're asking me, his whole book was aimed, in a way, Wealth of Nations. He always thought the first book was his better book, but in Wealth of Nations, he was talking about the absolute importance of international trade, and that mercantilism was nothing but protectionism for special interests, protection for their monopolies, protection for subsidies, and he was very much against it and thought it should be completely free.
Ms. Rand.
On this subject, there is no daylight between us. I completely agree.
Awesome. Okay. Wonderful. Our first question.
Good morning. This is my greatest experience to meet Jeff Tucker and to meet you two. Unfortunately, you've gotten much better looking in your age. Yes.
Thank you. I've been having very many years of beauty sleep.
Amen.
And also,
this question is basically for both of you. I've used Atlas Shrugged. Adam Smith's Moral Sentiments is in my most recent book, which you have received, The Failed Experiment. But the conflict between you two bothers me a tad. Cannot God be reason? Can't he be the source of our natural abilities to discern good from evil, right from wrong?
well, then that was the source of God, if he is the source of our reason, I guess. I am not hostile. I do not believe that you have to give up your belief in a mystical entity. However, I do not think that it is the proper basis for morality or the proper basis for man's mind.
Adam Smith?
Well, I think that Adam Smith believed religion was very important, as I've said. Was he himself religious? Yes, he was. Was Samuel Johnson religious? Yes, he was. Religion was a big deal, and in Western Europe now, churches are empty, and you wonder whether there's a connection between some of the breakdown in Western Europe and the fact that the churches are empty. I don't know.
Okay.
I'd like to ask if either or both of you think that there's a role for the state in the correction of market failures or in the combating of monopoly.
Adam Smith.
Well, there's no value in a monopoly as far as Adam Smith was concerned. His greatest nightmare was that Edinburgh merchants would take control of parts of government for their own benefit and issue rules that would keep out their competitors. He said a government made up exclusively of merchants would be the worst form of a government of all. And he made the comment that businessmen, no two businessmen can get together in private without doing some harm to the public interest. So he was not a great, champion for unsupervised businessmen, and one of the reasons for spending money on judiciary was to make sure that these monopolies would not exist or could not exist.
So he favored some government action against some monopolies sometimes.
He certainly did, and he wanted government to stay out of correcting so-called mistakes as much as possible, because he felt that all government did when they got involved was make mistakes.
Ms. Rand?
I believe that a coercive monopoly is not the result of laissez-faire. It can result only from the abrogation of laissez-faire and from the introduction of the opposite principle, which is statism. Also, I believe the government has no role in recovering from financial crisis. Its role already was to create the crisis in the first place. The proper role is completely laissez-faire, hands off.
If I could just make a quick, the problem is that human nature, and this is what I was trying to say about the human nature being a little more complex than the black and white that I see in what you espouse, that the complexity of human nature is that government can get captured. It shouldn't be, but it can and does and has been captured. It's being captured right now. We live in a world of really bad crony capitalism, and we got to unwind it, and it's going to take some time. We have, our antitrust agencies both have programs to watch over the rest of the regulatory agencies to make sure that they are doing the freest thing possible. So we have bureaucracies against bureaucracies, making sure bureaucracies don't grow. And Smith understood that probably was inevitable.
Ms. Rand, way back when you, at some points, probably a couple times, have said that put forth the statement that no one had the right to 1 minute of your life unless you gave it to them. And I read, in Ayn Rand, and I taught my kids, when they were talking about Ayn Rand and philosophy when they were growing up, that the opposite with me. I tell them, I just reversed it. I always said to them, this is what Ayn Rand said, the way your dad says it is, I don't have the right to 1 minute of your life unless you give it to me. I said, the reason we don't drive drunk is not that you'll kill yourself. That's not so bad. Is that you might hurt somebody else and you have no right to their life. So why, Ms. Rand, were you so atomistic, or whatever you want to call it? Why was it always starting with you?
Why was it what?
Why did everything you're writing, I love Ayn Rand, but you're writing, why did it start with you and the atomistic approach?
Why did you believe in the virtue of selfishness?
The virtue of selfishness, and I rejected the altruism as the root of all evil. Perhaps, unlike those who have had the luxury of, in the United States, not having come face to face and having a personal experience with the ultimate consequences of the ideas that we must live for others, I actually had this experience in Russia, where we were told that the only justification for burdening the earth with our life was to live for the sake of others. And I saw in reality, in history, the consequences of this very evil idea, and that is also what I tried in my novels. Now remember, these were acts of fiction. These were fictional characters, and fiction and art is an act of dramatizing principles to which we must hold fast.
We have 2 minutes, so very
Rob Chatfield from the Free to Choose Network. And 250 years from now, will you two still be the philosophers on this stage, or who should be on this stage that's not here?
I hope we're still here.
Yeah, here. And Ms. Rand saying,
I plan to be here. I don't know about you.
Perfect. John.
So first, I want to compliment Ms. Rand on being an ardent celebrator of business, because I think as a libertarian, too many academic-minded people trip over themselves to not celebrate business and to not even use the term business, but to use capitalism or free market or some other abstraction that nobody but us understands. But my question is a tough one. So you define reason in a very particular way, but we as a creature aren't always rational, and we're groupish creatures. If you want to use reason's highest order being sort of the scientific method, efforts to try to study the human as a being find that we have this weird mix of social impulses and then sort of more rational seeming calculation. So how do you confront the irrationality of man, which is very sort of self-evident when you observe it? And that sort of related to that is, how do you confront the fact that we do not apply a kind of market reason to the family and to how we treat our kin, how we treat our children? And so if reason in a kind of mathematical sense is sort of the be-all end-all of morality, as a parent, I find myself lost with your formulation. Thank you.
The answer has to be very short. I'm so sorry, Ms. Rand.
Yes, I would say that market principles still do apply to certain situations in the family. Every relationship has its terms, and every relationship, even a family relationship, has its terms. Children have not yet reached a stage where they are capable of acting on the basis of their own moral judgment. Therefore, they have the parents who have a responsibility to them for bringing them into this world.
And I believe Adam Smith has a comment.
Well, Adam Smith and his friends and his colleagues, especially Samuel Johnson, were trying to understand the human nature, the psychology of it all. There are psychiatrists who still today go back and read Samuel Johnson to try to understand his insights into envy. So it is complicated. It isn't easy, and we're all sinners. Whether we are believers or not, we're all sinners. So I think what Ayn Rand has put forward is a great set of goals. What I think I put forward is a better system for trying to understand why we often behave in such counterproductive ways.
Let's give a round of applause to the great Adam Smith, the great